Why do we believe that there is substantial evidence for the case that Jesus indeed is alive? Now, again, we've already established we don't want to argue whether he lived or not. Like, we believe that Jesus is a historical figure. The question we need to answer is, did he rise from death? Now, there's some historical evidence we want to look at. One, there is historical evidence in support of the person of Jesus of Nazareth, and a lot of the works that the Gospels report are actually corroborated by outside voices outside of the Christian faith. You have voices like Josephus. He was a first century Jew who was employed, maybe I'll use that word lightly, implored by the Romans to record history. And a lot of the history that you and I take as fact came from this guy Josephus. And Josephus himself recorded and reported that Jesus of Nazareth lived and that he was a worker of miracles, quote, and that he was crucified by the Romans, and that there was a group of people who believed that he rose again from death. You also have external sources like Pliny the Elder and Tacitus, both first century Greek historians who also confirm the same thing that Josephus said. Hey, we don't totally know everything that's going on here. All we know is there was a guy named Jesus of Nazareth, and he absolutely turned that whole part of the world on its head. He was a worker of miracles, and there is a legion of people who are claiming that he rose from the dead. So you have these external voices beginning to corroborate some of the claims that we are making as Christians. Probably one of the best arguments for the first century claim about Jesus having risen from the dead is in some of his opponents being the Jewish rulers and leaders. Around the time of the resurrection, the Jews were putting out a claim that the disciples had stolen the body of Jesus. You actually see that in some of the Gospels. They reference that this was the claim, that the disciples stole the body. Well, we can talk about why that doesn't make sense in a second, but you know what that does prove? It proves that Jesus really died and that the tomb is really empty. Because they were saying, well, here's our explanation as to why the tomb is empty. Well, check empty tomb. You have opponents confirming with us that the tomb indeed is empty. So you have these historical corroborating evidences, but we also have the biblical witness. If you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you have 4 accounts of eyewitness testimony as to what happened about this man named Jesus. Specifically, all 4 of them tell the same story, that he is the Messiah, the Son of God, sent to save all of humanity, and that he was crucified on a Roman cross. He really died, he really was buried, and we really couldn't find him in the tomb. All 4 of them say that. And it's important that you understand something. The Gospels are historical books. They're designed and written in that way. Like, if you read the Gospels, like particularly Luke went there as a skeptic investigator, talking to eyewitnesses, trying to pinpoint where and how this all went down. And so they're calling on actual people and actual landmarks and actual witnesses. If you read Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, listen to this language here and see if this doesn't sound like someone trying to build a case that he wants you to test out. Look what he says. He says, "For I received what I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures that was already foretold, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that's Peter, "and then to the 12, and then after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living." Now, why would he include that? Because in his letter, he's saying, if you don't believe me, ask Bob. Bob was there, and Sally, and Serena, and Jimmy, and whatever other, like there was 500 of them. Go see for yourself. They'll tell you what they saw. And then he goes on and he says, he appeared to James, the brother of Jesus, more on him in a second, then to the apostles, and then of course I saw him, Paul says. So this testimony is an eyewitness testimony, and you've got to do something with that. That you have these people claiming to have seen Jesus as risen. Now, if we were building a case in a court of law, there's not just eyewitness testimony, but one of the things you try to do is you try to look for circumstantial evidence. Am I right? Got any lawyers here? No? Okay, well, you know what I mean. You watched Law and Order. You know how it works. Suits, right? Circumstantial evidence is stuff that points in favor of the claim. And there is a lot of circumstantial evidence surrounding the Gospels and surrounding these claims, things that aren't the story itself, but point to the validity of the story. Does that make sense? Stuff like, for instance, the weird jagged edges in the Gospels. If you read the Gospels, sometimes, let me know if any of you have had this experience. You've read Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and there's a detail in there, and you're like, why is that even in here? Stuff like John, the disciple that Jesus loved, running to the tomb faster than Peter. Like, just so you know, I'm a quicker sprinter than Peter. Like, why is that even in there? Here's why. Because that's how it happened. When you start to read the Gospels, you start to see very quickly that they're not there with some agenda, some conspiratorial agenda. They're actually just writing down what actually happened. This is why when you read about the risen Christ, it says one of the times he appeared to the disciples, he showed up, he passed through a wall and he just showed up, boo, and they're all there. And then it says he was hungry, so he sat down and he ate some broiled fish and honeycomb. Why is that in there? Because it happened. No other reason. There's no other reason to include that other than it happened. And these little jagged edges help build the case that these disciples weren't trying to do anything other than create a case and tell the story as it happened. One of the great criticisms of the faith we have as followers of Jesus is that this is just a story made up by the disciples to try to build a religion to control and brainwash people. Anybody heard something along those lines? The problem with that is the Gospels aren't that sneaky. They aren't that crafty. And if the disciples were men who were trying to concoct this grand story to control people, you would never include details like the broiled fish and honeycomb. Beyond that, though, there are some problematic details that are included that completely blow up that idea that this was some story that these guys made up. Specifically, here's one: how stupid the disciples look. Let me ask you a question. If you were going to create a conspiracy and it was going to come through you and you're going to be the champion of said conspiracy, would you make yourself look like an idiot? Probably not. But if you read the Gospels, you see these disciples are as dumbfounded and confused as anybody. In fact, they look really bad. If you read the Gospels multiple times, Jesus said, I'm going to be crucified, and on the third day I'm going to rise again. I'm going to be crucified, and on the third day I'm going to rise again. I'm going to be crucified, and on the third day I'm going to rise again. Are you getting this? But what do we find when Jesus is crucified? All the disciples flee. They're like, I didn't see that coming. And then on the third day, when Jesus said multiple times on the third day, you have, count them, 0 disciples asking the question, hey, didn't Jesus say something about the third day? Should we just go, just in case, go check it out? Just in case. You didn't have one of them even suggesting that that's a good idea. All we had was Mary Magdalene going to the tomb because there was some stuff they had to finish because they weren't able to finish it preparing his body because it was the Sabbath. So they went back there just to do what they needed to do to prepare his body as they laid him to rest. And that's where they found the empty tomb. But the point I'm trying to make here is these guys did not position themselves as heroes. They were zeros just trying to record what happened. So if you are creating some grand conspiracy, you would never write yourself into being the loser in the story. But beyond that, there's a more critical piece of circumstantial evidence, and that is this. Here's the number one reason, one of the best reasons, one of the smoking gun reasons why it's not a good argument to say the disciples created this, but in fact, they were just telling the story as it happened, is because the testimony about Jesus came first and foremost through the voice of women. In the first century, this is very far removed and foreign to us, but in the first century, women had no voice, literally no voice. Not only couldn't they vote, they couldn't even testify in court. Like there was they were seen as second-class citizens, and women did not have the same equal rights as men. And actually, there's a Greek philosopher named Celsus, and he was one of the early opponents of Christianity. And his number one argument to try to dispel the claims of Christianity was that, well, here's the number one reason we can't believe that Christianity is true, because it came on the testimony of women. And he said, quote, "And we all know women are hysterical." His words, not mine. But to which the first century would all have gone, "Oh, right, you can't trust the voice of women." Right? My point is this, though. If the disciples were just conjuring up this grand story so that 2,000 years after they're dead, we'd be here participating and rehearsing it, they never would have used women to be the bringers of that original message. That's shooting yourself in the foot before it even goes. And yet, here we have these Christians insistent that this is how it happened. That Mary Magdalene found the empty tomb, and she came and told Peter, and then Peter went and saw it, and John out-sprinted him, and he saw it too. And then he appeared to the disciples after that. They tell it this way because it happened that way. Probably one of the bigger pieces of evidence in all of it, though, is just the testimony of the followers of Jesus. What do you do with the early converts? How do you explain that before this moment in history, there was nobody claiming that Jesus is Lord or that he's risen, and then after that moment, like a wildfire, you have dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands, then millions, and then billions of people who have all claimed Jesus is risen? How do you explain that? What explanation do you come up with when you take into account some of Jesus' earliest followers were his biggest critics before the resurrection? You had Jewish people who it was forbidden to worship a man. You would never do that. And in fact, many of the early Christians were kicked out of their synagogues because they were Jews. They were disowned by their own families because they were worshiping this man, Jesus. You have people like James, the brother of Jesus. Let me ask you a question. What would you have to do to make your brother worship you? You ever thought of that? You had James, the brother of Jesus, who was against Jesus before the resurrection, after that saying, "My Lord and my God." You had people like Paul the Apostle, the Pharisee of Pharisees, ardently against these Christians, and then the risen Jesus comes and shows himself to him, and he flips 180, and all of a sudden he is the biggest ambassador for this message that Jesus is risen. What do you do with that? And then what do you do with the first 200 years where Christianity spans through the Roman Empire, where it topples this empire, and by 200-year mark, you have it being the primary religion on planet Earth? How do you explain that? Moreover, though, what do you do with the fact that the disciples, if they were just creating some conspiracy, and they cooked this lie up out of their imaginations, and they were maybe that smart to do it, what do you do with the fact that every single one of them suffered and died for this? Do you know what I've found in my life? That lies are only as good as they serve you. And ultimately, how many of you know lies end up not being good in the end anyway? They always turn out worse than you thought. But nobody hangs on to a lie once they realize, hey, this is going bad for me. Correct? So what lunatic would cook up something like this only to go and suffer for decades and then ultimately die for what they believe, not recanting? Only somebody who truly believed it dies for it. So my question to you is, what do you do with the evidence? Like, the evidence around these claims of Christianity is actually staggering. And I would encourage some of you who are still maybe on the fence to dive in and do some research and just push past some of the intellectual arrogance and laziness of our day. One of the things I tell myself when I have doubts, and specifically when they're born in my mind, is that people a lot smarter than me have decided that Jesus is risen and that he is Lord. when you look at the circumstantial evidence for the resurrection and you consider the eyewitness testimony, the evidence begins to lean dramatically in the direction that maybe Jesus really is who he says he is, and maybe he really is risen.